Well, Daniel, it's been 2 months or so since we've talked about Fargo.
Indeed.
But here we are to talk about our favorite season ever. And it goes boom. This is a true podcast. Yeah. And then it's us this time. Yeah. Hello all. It's been a while. Hopefully you didn't forget about Fargo, but here we are, talking about Fargo Season 2, which aired from October 2015 to December 2015. But before we go there, let's kind of talk about like the state of Fargo at the time and where it was. There was the original 1996 movie that came out, directed by the Coen brothers. After that was a long hiatus of no Fargo, until 2014 came along with a little season 1 action.
Right. The TV show, season 1 of the show, is as successful as it is, not just because of its quality, which, you know, obviously it's like one of the tightest and cleanest and best just single seasons of television ever, but it's also successful because of how close it stays to the original movie. So when they announced that there was going to be a season 2, I was like, what? That doesn't, okay. I mean, I'll take more Fargo, but I don't see what the angle here is. I don't know what the story is. You already did the movie. Is it going to be a sequel? Is it going to be, I don't know. Is it going to be about Billy Bob Thornton's character before this? I had no idea what it could possibly be. Just the decision to do a season 2 on its own was pretty bold, but then to go ahead and set it in the past and base it on Lou, who is sort of a tertiary character in the first season, was another really bold choice. I feel like it's become a little bit more common to do stuff like this, but still, I mean, there's not a lot of hugely successful TV shows that have a blueprint, work well, and then say, okay, let's reverse engineer this and go backwards in time and do a whole different thing and totally change the whole genre of the piece. Let's do this whole pulpy 70s thing. Let's just go crazy with the music and with the editing. Let's do something completely different. So it's such a bold choice. And it's such a departure from the first season. I think that's one of the reasons why I love this season so much and why it's my favorite season, is just because of the boldness of storytelling and the boldness of that creative decision to do it in the first place.
Yeah, and you say an interesting point too with the movie and the TV series up till season 1 being kind of the same story and also just sort of just being a soft reboot of the movie in a lot of ways, in a modern way. This is a bold choice for this next season, and it totally pays off. But I remember at the time, I think we talked in high school, but it was basically like, yeah, I don't know what they're doing with this second season, and I don't know if I'm going to watch it because it's kind of like not going to be the formulaic Fargo that we're all used to.
At that point also, what you said, it was 2014 that season 1 came out. So at that point, when season 1 comes out, well, you don't expect them to go into the 70s and tell this very weird story. You expect them to do the continuation of season 1 because that's just what television shows did.
No, but you do make a good point about the anthology aspect of this, because the only other show doing that was American Horror Story.
Right.
And no offense to American Horror Story lovers. I watched 2.5 seasons and I could not watch it afterwards. Not because it was gross. I just didn't like it. Like, this is also so different because there's a new cast every season too. It's not like American Horror Story where they just bring back the same cast every season for new characters. Like, this is like completely different and new things. Like, it's like the Star Wars anthology movies they were making for a while. But again, that was before those came out. So this was really the first of its kind.
That's a really good comparison, actually, Star Wars and Fargo. We take Empire for granted just in general as in like how it shaped Star Wars, because A New Hope is a great movie. It's a groundbreaking movie. But without Empire being as good as it is, Star Wars is not what it is today. And I feel that way about Fargo season 2 also. Season 1 is a great standalone season of television, and they could have just left it completely alone and it would have stood just fine. But the fact that season 2 is as good as it is, it's even better than season 1, and it's bolder and it's more daring and it adds more to the lore, sort of like Empire did with Star Wars. That's what makes season 2 great, but that's also what makes Fargo a franchise now. So the Empire comparison to Fargo season 2, I think, is actually kind of an interesting one that we just stumbled upon.
This just changes the Fargo universe in so many ways, and similar to Empire, the way it's shot is just so different than its predecessors.
Right.
And it looks incredible. It's one of the most beautiful seasons of television out there. But let's just talk a little bit about our favorite scene, our favorite one scene from this season, and then we can kind of branch off and start talking about the characters we love so much, because Fargo, at the end of the day, is about characters.
Right.
And that is what keeps people coming back.
If I had to point to one scene, then I'd have to point to the very first episode in the, what's it called? The Waffle Hut, right? When Rye Gerhart goes in there with the intention of intimidating a judge, things do not work out, ends up killing the judge, killing a fry cook, killing one of the waitresses, walks outside and gets hit by a car. As an inciting incident, this is one of the most electrifying that I can think of in recent memory, certainly on TV. It is quintessential Fargo, because it's this bumbling idiot criminal who fails at what they're trying to do and then dies in the most hilarious but also like kind of sad way possible. He's just a bumbling coke addict, walks out into the middle of the road, sees a light in the sky, which we'll talk about later, and then gets hit by a car. So that scene obviously sets the stage for the plot for the whole season. I love that Rye Gerhart isn't the main character of this season. I think that's what the heart of it is. Because in season 1, Martin Freeman is the one who, conducts the inciting incident. And then the season follows his perspective. This season, though, we spend a little bit of time with him. We kind of get to know him a little bit. You kind of start to see like, oh, this could be a character that we follow throughout the season. And like, what's he going to do? And then he dies immediately. And then who kills him? It's Peggy, which is revealed later. Everything about this scene just works for me. Everything about this scene feels Fargo. Everything about this scene elevates and improves upon what came before it. So that's probably my favorite scene in season 2, although there are a lot of favorite scenes.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the scene a little more with you for a sec before I reveal my scene.
Absolutely.
But you hinted at it, that the whole idea of Peggy hitting him in that moment is so good. And it's also, they don't show it to you. Mm-hmm. Like you were saying, like if an astute mind watching this scene would think that the UFO or light in the sky or whatever and the car are somehow connected because of how it's shot, it looks like it's a distraction for the car to hit Rye. Uh-huh. But in reality, that's not the case. So it's like an interesting like point and like beginning. It's an interesting point and hint at like what's to come in this season. Like there is going to be UFO shit and there's also going to be like human shit, but they're like not connected in a way. But in that scene, it like feels so connected. Cause like when I watched that the first time, I'm like, oh, that has to be like somehow connected. Maybe it's like a different gang or something. Cause like, what are the odds of that happening?
Yeah. And to your point, the Coen Brothers universe, as it were, is very bleak. There's this universal bleakness. And so the randomness of this event fits in completely with that. So that randomness of Rye looking up, seeing a UFO after this botchery, and then getting hit by a car, and the car just happens to be Peggy. That randomness is, in another show, kind of like, you're kind of scratching your head going like, okay, well, that's a bit too random. Like, that's kind of lame. What are the coincidences of that? But in this universe, which emphasizes this bleak randomness, it totally works. And it's a perfect inciting incident.
Great scene. All right. So since you picked at the beginning of the season, I'm going to go more towards the end of the season.
Perfect.
I'm going to pick the final sequence from episode 8, Low Plop. So as a refresher, Ed comes home from talking to Mike Milligan on the phone saying he's got Dodd Gerhart in his car. And I almost picked that scene because that seems really good too. But he's coming home and he comes back to this cabin and he sees Peggy on the floor, knocked out. And he like walks towards her, and then Dodd comes out and like puts a noose around Ed's neck and starts hanging him. And then this basically all leads up to HANZEE coming in. Peggy and Ed get like the upper hand, and then HANZEE comes in and then shoots Dodd Gerhart in the head. And then Lou comes, and then everyone's just like running. There's like that nice like shot of the scissors where Peggy stabs HANZEE in the neck. He like runs out, tries to shoot, but he's already taken 6 shots, runs out, and the drums kick in. Whenever the drums kick in Fargo, it's so sick. This scene is so good because it basically brings all of these storylines together in such a way that writes every character into a corner in that sequence. So Dodd is dead, so I guess it doesn't matter for him. HANZEE is on the run again, and he also just killed Dodd, which is crazy. Ed and Peggy just got caught by Lou, and now Lou is just like, I have no clue what to do now because there's just this HANZEE guy running around, and we just got Ed and Peggy. And I just think that sequence is so good. And it just ends the episode in such a strong way with Ed and Peggy raising their hands and being like, all right, you got us. And you're like, wow, there's 2 episodes left after this.
The point that you made about how this scene writes everybody into their corner is another quintessentially Fargo thing. That's what Fargo's all about, is pushing people all the way to the end of the rope and just seeing how long they can hold on. And so in this moment, all these characters are pushed to their corners, and it's one of my favorite parts of the plot is the HANZEE element of it. HANZEE's decision to betray Dodd and betray the Gerharts is just one of my favorite moments in television, and makes the character really, because all season long, HANZEE, and we'll talk more about HANZEE later, but all season long, he's kind of just hanging around. He's in the wings watching, doing the bidding of the Gerharts. And at least I am watching him and I'm like, there's something here. Like, this is really an interesting character. I wonder where he's going to go. And at some point I started to kind of give up on that a little bit. I was like, maybe they're not going to do anything super crazy with HANZEE. Maybe he's just going to be a cool, like, errand boy for the Gerharts, basically. But no, he shows up and you think, oh, he's going to retrieve him and then maybe kidnap Ed and Peggy. No. Kills Dodd Gerhart and then asks for a haircut, which is one of my favorite lines of dialogue, maybe ever. That's so beautiful and poetic. He beautifully articulates everything that he needs to articulate just by asking, like, for a haircut. He just, he's tired of this life, is what he says.
Tired of this life, yeah. He kind of whispers it.
I mean, talk about an amazing character moment. But everything about this episode and everything about the scene, oh God, it's so good. I can't get enough of it. I do watch the scene pretty often. I'll just go on YouTube and type in.
I do too. I think it's the most watched Fargo scene I've seen. It's I think it's a perfect sequence, and it builds wonderfully. And you genuinely don't know what's going to happen at the beginning of it. You're like, oh, so how is anyone going to get out of here? And, somehow miraculously, like, Ed and Peggy kind of are saved by Lou, which is definitely a reoccurring thing throughout the entire season. And just on that, like, kind of let's jump in to the characters this season.
Yeah.
If you would like, I think starting with Lou might be good.
Yeah.
I think Lou's the lead more or less of this season, and he's definitely like the moral compass of this season.
Totally.
But yeah, Lou is played by Patrick Wilson, formerly played by Keith Carradine in season 1. But Lou is a completely different character this season just because he's a younger man, and you basically just see more of him in general. You see him being a wonderful father figure to Molly, and a good husband to Betsy. I think of that sequence where they're outside of the Waffle Hut after the murder.
Yeah.
After all the murders. And like Molly is there with him. He just like brings her along because he's like, well, why not? I'll just bring the family along to just check out the Waffle Hut. And there's a real reserved aspect to Lou. I don't think Lou's not the most engaging character this season, but he definitely holds it all together. And you can kind of see his arc this season is being demystified by the United States and like just like the police system in general. It's pretty subtle, and like obviously at the end he's still driving a cop car, but it really tracks well with season 1 Lou, who owns like a cafe, and he doesn't do any of the cop stuff anymore.
Yeah, I really like Lou. I think Lou as a character is a really strong character. I'm sure it was all there on the page for Patrick Wilson, but I do think in the hands of a lesser actor, this could have derailed the season probably because of the reserved nature of the character and because of the subtlety of the character and everything that's going on with him and Betsy and him and all of the other characters. With a lesser performance, the season really could have been derailed is I guess my point there. But Patrick Wilson holds it down because he's like one of those movie stars that really hasn't blown up to become a total movie star. Like he stars in movies. So technically he's a movie star, but like he should have been Superman like 15 years ago. He should have been one of the
Batman.
Yeah. Or Batman. He could have been one of the biggest stars just ever, because he has such a classical Hollywood leading man face and physique and delivery.
Yeah, he looks like he's related to Charles Heston or something like that.
That's
like
a great
Hollywood
comp.
royalty. Yeah, no. I just thought of it. It was crazy. And he is in big movies. Like he was in Aquaman.
Right. Yeah.
He was Owlman and Watchmen.
And he's the lead in the Conjuring movies and in Insidious and yeah. So no, he's definitely like a leading man in movies, but
no one talks about Patrick Wilson enough, I think.
Nobody talks about Patrick Wilson anymore. They done forgot about Pat Wilson, you know? But he's like such a great anchor for this season. And you can always hang your hat on Patrick Wilson in this season. Lou Silverson is like a coat rack. He's just consistent and he's just there. And yet he still also surprises you. So that's not a totally apt analogy, but I do really like the character. And I think that where they take him with the Reagan stuff is really good. And to your point, sort of ending up in a place where he is disillusioned, much like the country. And that's sort of as an overarching piece of this season also is just being set in 1979, being able to comment on the 70s, on the Vietnam War, and then also on what's about to come in the 80s and commercialism and the Reagan era politics. All of that is really fun, especially if you're interested in politics.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating. This is why I also really like this season. Like, I think it has the most to say about cops and how like kind of fucked up the whole thing is.
That's a good point.
More so than any other season, and I think that plays into our liking it a lot. I don't think we picked it up when we watched it,
right.
But like our brains, as Mr. Plinkett would say, but our brains did. All of these just heads of these departments are just horrible, and they're also cast with people that are like a little like bigger and like kind of like it has like a very like, you know, the pig like feel of cops in some ways, and that's with Ben Schmidt too, who's a recurring character from season 1. He's much older and he's still a dick, and it really. Season 2 just makes season 1 so much better because like when Lou talks to Colin Hanks, but how Lou and Colin Hanks in season 1 talk about Ben Schmidt, like Lou's all like, is he still a prick? And like Colin Hanks is like, yeah, big time. And it's like, you can see how much of a dick Ben Schmidt is in this season. And it's really cute, but at the end of the day, he still has kind of like a hero's little journey for Ben Schmidt too. But it's just a really interesting character with Lou and his whole dynamic with the cops.
Yeah, and just in general on that point, this is more general, but I like the way that this season does world building. And I'll jump back into Patrick Wilson in a second, but like that little line in season 1, I don't know when they decided that they were going to do a season 2. I don't know when Noah Hawley picked up on the fact that, I could do a whole season with this guy Lou. But all of those little lines that occur in season 1, they get paid off, but not in like an obnoxious Star Wars fan service kind of way, but just in a way that feels natural. And they also don't pay off on certain other things, like Lou getting shot in the hip. He's got that limp in season 1. That just happens chronologically in between season 2 and season 1. And so
Molly's mom doesn't die this season.
Exactly. And that's actually,
which is so good.
Yeah. That's where I wanted to go next, was because we were talking before the podcast about all of these characters that are in relationships and how they're all in different phases of a relationship. The one relationship that really sticks with me is, they all stick with me. I love this. I love this season, but
so good.
Lou and Betsy have one of my favorite relationships, because I think it has a lot to say about men and women of that era. It has a lot to say about men and women in general. It has a lot to say about grief and loss and appreciating people when they're here. And it just has so much to say without literally saying anything, like dialogue wise. They just don't talk about the issue. Betsy's dying, and she has a terminal illness, and they know that, and they have this situation where they can take a placebo drug, or maybe it's the real drug. They don't know. And there's a frustration in the air with the inability to talk about it. And you can tell that people of this era, they just didn't have the tools of communication to be able to say like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. And how are you feeling? They just don't talk about it. And that's so powerful. And I think that by the end of the season, when Betsy has what I consider her death scene, even though she doesn't actually die, it's so gripping, because like she doesn't need to die on camera, because you're basically getting her death anyway. In a way, it's like a simulated death. It's like people who have their funerals while they're still alive, You get to like
you, Daniel.
Exactly. I had my funeral last week.
We had it 3 weeks ago.
It was touching. Yeah. Everybody said really nice things. But so when she has that apparent death, I got and I still get choked up.
Yeah, that's a powerful scene.
Yeah, even though I've seen this season at least 3 times all the way through, whenever I watch that scene, it really gets to me, because I know how much Lou loves her and I think this is what it is. If she did die and Lou didn't get to say all the things that he wanted to say, that would be pretty crushing. And you get that feeling all season long, is like, are they ever going to talk about this? Like before she dies, are they ever going to be able to say how they feel about this? It's a powerful dynamic, and I don't know. I just think it's a very powerful dynamic, and it's one of my favorite relationships that I've seen on TV.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting, and yeah, that sequence of just her seeing the future is just so beautiful, and it also comes like close to when she has another powerful scene with Carl Weathers. Yeah, where it gets me teared up every time, but it just basically like her being like, you'll take care of him, right? And it's not like she's referring to Molly or anything. She's like referring to Lou, and it speaks to the relationship a lot, and like also just Carl Weathers being the best character in the season, because he's all like, you're gonna beat this thing, you motherfucker.
Everything about Carl Weathers is great.
Yeah, and just to like mix it up, we'll probably talk about him a little later. But yeah, so Lou and Betsy definitely speak to two people in the prime of their relationship, but not being able to be in the prime of their relationship because of the horrible thing, the horrible impending doom of their relationship and their lives together. It's like gonna end. And it's something that happens not even when people are about to die. It's just like the expiration date of someone moving, or the expiration date of like them getting a job or getting into college. It's like, this is such like a relatable thing, because like you want to say all this stuff in it, but you literally can't, because you're thinking about the end every time. And that's something they do really well. And it's such a nice twist at the end when she doesn't die. And you're like, oh, this is nice. Like, it doesn't have to be like another Star Wars movie, Revenge of the Sith, where everything is just perfect at the end of episode 3 and nothing happens for 17 years. Everyone just gets older and then they start doing it again. But like, this is nice where it's like, oh, stuff happens between season 1 and 2 and we don't need to talk about it because that's not important to the story we're telling.
And sort of speaking to that sort of bleak randomness that I was talking about earlier, it's like, stuff happens in between seasons, and like it could probably make for a pretty good season on its own. Like, I'm sure when Lou got shot in the hip, that'd be an interesting episode of television. Or, young Molly going through the ranks of the police station. I don't know. There's a number
baby
of...
Police. She goes to baby police station.
She goes to a baby police station.
She's all like, Molly, we're enrolling you in this baby police station. And she's like, all right. And she like goes in. She's
got the police uniform up top and then diapers down below.
Yeah, it's really fun. And then at one point she has like a balloon and she puts it under her shirt, so it like looks like she's pregnant. It's like, whoa, it's like season 1.
That's right.
It's like when she's pregnant. Oh man, I hate fan service like that, and right. I think Fargo has done that kind of sometimes, but like not to that stupid extent of having baby Molly go to police store and she meets baby Colin Hanks.
Right.
who wants to be a mailman, but Tom Hanks, his father in this season, is making him go to baby police academy.
Yeah, I think that would be a great season, and I think we should get Noah Hawley on the phone and just work that one out.
All right, moving along, we'll get back to some of Lou's friends and mentors soon. But let's switch it up to the Gerharts, who are arguably the second leads of this season. Their ends are tragic, but all the Gerharts, just to run them down real fast, we'll talk about all of them. We got Otto and Floyd, and then we have this 3 sons, Dodd, Bear, and Rye. Bear's son is Charlie. Dodd's daughter is Simone, and then we have Dodd's right-hand man, who is HANZEE. All the Gerharts die this season. They represent an old mafia family that is nearing the end of its life. Otto, who built this whole thing in the 1950s with, say it with me, Mort Kellerman.
That's right.
Who is also in season 4 of Fargo. But he builds this empire and then he has a stroke. And then the Kansas City mob's like, we're going to come in here and we're just going to take your shit. So the Gerharts are kind of up against the wall the whole season. We kind of talked about that with the Ed and Peggy scene and HANZEE and Dodd scene. But the entire season, the Gerharts are just like up against the wall. They're trying to fight for their, lives. And it's really interesting because I feel like typically when you see mafia families, they're 100% like evil, or like one of them like is like super mean. There's not really like any subtlety. Like even with the Fadas in season 4, like they like Josto and Gaetano were pretty like evil,
right?
For the most part, like they're bad guys. But like the Gerharts are like, yes, Dodd's a bad guy, but like Bear and especially Floyd like have this, and even Rye, they have this kind of sense that like this is just what they kind of got swept up into, and they're not necessarily like the bad guys of the season. But again, similar to what we talked about with Lou and Betsy, there's a sense of impending doom with all the Gerharts, and that doom actually does come, unlike Betsy.
So that's also why season 2 is great, is because there is this overarching political message and social message of like the impending era that's about to come of the 80s and the death of small businesses and the death of these sort of family businesses like the Gerharts. And so this impending doom that all of the characters feel, whether it's because they've done something terrible and they're on the run, or it's because there's a terminal illness, or it's because there's a Kansas City mob coming in trying to take your shit. Whatever the reason is, everybody is feeling that impending doom, which is also why that's such good writing, because you have this overarching message of this impending doom that's coming about sort of basically the death of America in the 80s. And all of the characters are feeling the same thing, but in their own internalized way. And with the Gerharts, I think that you're spot on. Like, they aren't just bad guys. Like, they are the bad guys, but then Kansas City is also like worse. So it's like,
yeah. And
that's what, I mean, if I may, for a moment, that's what moving images is best at, like more so than any other art form. It's empathy and perspective. And so in this season, you're being put into a lot of different perspectives. You're in Lou's perspective. He's a cop in the 70s. You're in the Gerharts perspective, and they're this small run kind of mafia gangster group. Then you're also in Mike Milligan's perspective, and all of the characters are given a level of empathy, or they're asking you to empathize with them to a certain extent, while still acknowledging that they're bad people, or that they're flawed people, or that they're good people, whoever we're talking about. And another thing that I love about the Gerharts is just the variety of character within the family. That may seem kind of obvious, because if you are going to have a family depicted on screen, you have to have levels to the shit. And so all of it is, you can feel the Jenga blocks being pulled out one by one. You just don't know who's going to knock it over, but it's certain to fall over at some point.
No, definitely. You're spot on with that. And there's even infighting with like Bear and Simone. Like, Simone doesn't kind of betray the family. She like sleeps with Mike Milligan, not because like she's like a whore, but because like she like likes him and she's rebellious. And again, she's symbolic of like the 70s and stuff. Simone is such an interesting character. But that's the exact thing. Like, all the Gerharts are just like so interesting. And again, their ends are all so sad, because they're all just torn apart by every side, by the Gerharts, by Kansas City, by Lou. Like, Otto's killed by the Kansas City Mafia. Floyd and Dodd are killed by HANZEE. Rye's killed by Peggy. Like, Simone's killed by Bear. Like, again, I just listed them all, but like, they're all killed by just like, no one really is killed by the same thing. And it's tragic, because like, I don't know, they could be good. And this is when I think we should talk about Otto and Floyd.
Sure.
They are the second relationship we'll talk about out of 3. They have a very interesting dynamic. There's not a lot of them together. Mm-hmm. For the most part, Otto's in a wheelchair the entire season after having a stroke. It's an older relationship, but it's also a relationship filled with impending doom, which is the thing we keep talking about this season.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that gets me all teary-eyed all the time is just thinking about, God, and this is gonna make me sound like such an asshole, like I'm trying to get like sympathetic points or whatever, but like it really does, and I shouldn't even have to say it because it's so obvious, but like it's really sad, the amount of the lives of women that were wasted, like the potential that was wasted for thousands of years. Floyd Gerhart should have probably always been the leader of the Gerharts, and it took this stroke, this miraculous moment for Floyd for Otto to become, put into a comatose state, basically, for her to actually have the opportunity to then lead. But then even then, at that point, her own son is like, no, you're a woman, you can't be the leader. And then on top of that, Kansas City is like, no, you're a woman, you're sensitive, you can't be a leader. So even though she's like technically a bad guy, like, it's still like that sort of sense of frustration of, at this time it might be second wave feminism, I think, in the pursuit of trying to achieve equality. I think that's an interesting, not fully explicit part of the season, but definitely something that you can read into. Floyd is more than qualified to be doing the job, but at every opportunity she is being questioned because of her gender. I think the more general point is just that every character is dealing with something like that. Like every character has their own thing, and all of that's why this season is so great too, is because it's a very political season. And so Floyd is dealing with sort of gender politics, and so is Peggy. Peggy also has that incredible speech that we'll talk about at the end of the season, about how hard it is to be a woman in this era. And so you're getting that the gender politics from both an older woman in the season and then a younger woman in the season, and even Simone as well. The show just has so much to say about so many different things, and that's why it's a great season of television. Yeah, certainly. And similarly, like even though Dodd, can you do your Dodd impression for us, Daniel? Yeah, it's, Dodd kind of sounds a little bit like Bill Murray in Caddyshack. It's, Dad, it's with the tongue. Like you kind of soften or you blunten the tongue a little bit. And so give me a line. Give me a Dodd line. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I believe the devil is a woman. Think about it, is the line I'll give you. Something like that. That's what he says. The devil is a woman. No, that was a terrible Dodd impression. But one thing that does always stick with me is when he's interrogating. We see him in the barn and he's interrogating someone, and then it's revealed that he cut off his ears, and so he can't hear, and he's actually in fact dead. And Dodd just goes, weak. Yeah, no, it's so good. So good. But even with him and Floyd's dynamic, there are still moments that are super sweet. Like after Kansas City's like, all right, you don't want to take this offer? Like, we're going to kill you and we're going to win. So fuck you and I'll see you later. And then Dodd fucks up also because he gets angry and he was also the one who attacked the guy in the donut shop and all this stuff. Can I get a... Oh, that's it. That's the line. Can I get an old fashioned? Yeah. Can I get a chocolate glaze? And what do you want? An old fashioned? An old fashioned. All right. There it goes. But when they're driving home, they're in the back of the car and Floyd and Dodd are very upset. And Dodd just kind of leans his head on Floyd's shoulder and she kind of just pets him like a little kid because at the end of the day, this is what also makes the Gerharts really endearing, is that they're just a family. They're just a family at the end of the day, and this is just the business they're running. So, moving a little forward, we can get back to HANZEE and Dodd and all those guys later. But let's switch it up one more time and talk about Ed and Peggy, who are also main characters this season, is something I'm going to keep saying because everyone this season is the main character of their own story, for one, but also plays really important parts in the overall message of the season and just the season in general. I love Peg and Ed. I like Peg and I like Eddie. No, I love Ed and I love Peggy. But something about their relationship is they're an early relationship and they're very representative of just a relationship where both parties want different things and they can never get on the same page. And it is so good. And you want to fight for them because again, it makes you feel like you're in the relationship because you're this should work. You guys are good together and there's a lot of potential here, but it just never works. And I think a perfect example of that early on in the series is when Ed's I want to build a family here and I want to buy the butcher shop and all this shit. Yeah. And then Peggy's no, we got to leave. We got to get out of here. We got to fucking get self-affirmation and get the fuck out of here, all this shit. And then then Peggy's arc, the first half is her realizing no, this is my home, this is my family, I'm gonna make a family with Ed. And Ed's is holy shit, people are after me now and I gotta get out of here. And then they meet again halfway through the season and they're they literally want the opposite things again. It's Peggy's I want to have kids, and Ed's we gotta get the fuck out of here. And it's obviously it's very funny and ironic, but it's also super sad. And those are my opening thoughts on Ed and Peggy, I think. This, again, would be a thing that could derail the whole thing if they were just played for comedy. if it was like two comedic actors instead of two like really great dramatic actors, two of the best dramatic actors, frankly. If it was like two really purely comedic performances, then the heart falls out from the bottom. But instead, it's like it's dual parts funny and sad, and the reason that it's funny is because it's sad, and the reason that it's sad is because it's funny. It goes completely hand in hand, and the fact that they never get on the same page is, again, it speaks to the communication thing. All the characters are having trouble communicating with each other, and this is something that is just a part of that era. I love that Ed at the start of the season keeps talking about the butcher shop, and he has these really mundane aspirations, and Peggy throughout the whole season is about like the self. It's about improving the self, and not because she's selfish. And I'm sure a lot of Fargo fans would, or not Fargo fans, but just general TV people would probably call her selfish, but I wouldn't call her selfish. I would say that because she's a woman of this era, she's trying to just like figure out how to be a human being, basically. Like, how do I be my best self in a world that will not allow me to be my best self? And that ends up leading to just a stunning monologue at the end of the season in the back of Lou's police car, where she talks about, in somewhat of a frantic and nonsensical way, the nature of being a woman in this era. She's not a perfect character. She's full of flaws, and she is frantic and being like especially when she has Dodd tied up and she starts feeding him beans. Like, you're watching that and you're like, oh, she's crazy, but she's not crazy because she's just purely crazy. It feels like she's crazy because of what the patriarchy makes of her, basically. Like, her living in a world of men leads her to becoming this crazy person, basically, because she's just doing circles in her head. Like, I'm trying to have, like, it's impossible to have it all. Why can't I have it all? And this monologue at the end of the season is just an amazing way to leave her character.
That like speaks to like her unhappiness and like how she wants to be her best self, but she can't because no one believes in her and no one will believe in her ever. But yeah, she keeps feeding him beans, and she like asks, like, she's like, do you want more beans? And he's like, no. She just keeps feeding him beans. And then she's like, oh, you said you didn't want more beans. I'm sorry. And she starts stabbing him with a knife. It's like crazy. We talk about this a lot. There's always your Glenn Turmans every season. There's your Martin Freemans and Billy Bobs. This season is about everyone, but like also Kristen Dunst is just so good in it. And like at that point in her career, I feel like she was most well known for like Spider-Man.
Sure.
And I or like Melancholia or something, but
and like the Sofia Coppola movies and stuff that she was in. Yeah.
But this is certainly, I think for me, this is, and she was in Anchorman too.
The list just keeps going, actually.
Wide shot. Yeah, she's actually, I'm looking at her IMDb, and she's actually a really well-known actor.
She played Hal in 2001: A Space Odyssey, it says. Oh, that's weird.
That's odd. She was actually Frances McDormand in Fargo, the first movie.
And Nomadland.
And Nomadland, huh. Watch our Nomadland review. But it's my favorite performance of hers, and it is genuine, it's heartbreaking, and again, that monologue, I think, deserves all the awards. And to counterbalance her is Jesse Plemons, who Noah Hawley describes as a cow.
Right.
Yeah, and also we'll touch on this real fast. Jesse Plemons and Kristen Dunst are like married now, and they like, I'm pretty sure they met on set of this.
I think so.
Yeah, but super cool, and they're a great couple, and I think they're really cute together. But anyways, he is described as a cow, and not Jesse Plemons as a person, I think he's beautiful.
Yeah. Go watch our Judas and the Black Messiah review.
Yeah. His character of Ed Blumquist is certainly just kind of grazing, and it's such an interesting counterbalance to Kristen Dunst, who wants to self-affirm and all this stuff, and he kind of just goes along with it. And his arc this season is just heartbreaking because he's like dying in like the supermarket, and he's just like, how did I end up here? Like, I don't, like, I didn't want any of this. Like, he didn't want to run. He didn't want to do anything. He just like wanted to own a butcher shop and have kids and like live the typical Midwest life. And he like doesn't get that. And what does that say about like, I'm genuinely asking, like, what does that say about like the Midwest culture? Like, what does that say about Ed in general? Like, what, I don't think he makes any bad decisions in this season because he only goes along with stuff. But I mean, what do you think that says about Ed and his whole character?
Well, I think, you know, the sort of overarching political message that we've talked about the impending doom of the 80s, it doesn't totally fully translate to Ed and Peggy, but I think you could still extrapolate this piece of it, that Ed is this sort of typical American. And well, it actually kind of goes to the point that Ted Danson's character makes to Lou early in the season, when he says, like, I think that you boys might have brought the sickness over with you from the war. And so there's this feeling of like America is dying and it's sick and the good guys don't win. I think that's I think in a lot of ways that's something that happens this season. Obviously we end it in a very positive way with Lou and Betsy going to bed. So in some ways the good guys win, but in other ways they don't. And so Ed is just one of the casualties of this upcoming decade of America being awful and terrible. The fact that he's just a regular guy and he is like kind of the biggest tragic casualty of the season is certainly interesting and worth dissecting. Because I do think it
that's why I asked.
But also, like in his last scene when he's dying in the meat room, the meat freezer also, and which is, you know, I guess some might say like very on the nose, but like just perfect in my mind, just beautiful. I don't remember what his
what? Whoa. Yeah. I never thought of it like that. No, okay.
Imagine if nobody 7 years later, or however many, it's like this is
like listening. Everyone in the comments like, what? I didn't even put that together.
He worked at a butcher shop. But he, I don't remember what his last words are exactly, but they're really sad because he's kind of like, hey, honey, like, you're kind of crazy and I didn't want any of this. And like, it's basically like, we're not going to work out. And then he just dies. It's funny and sad. Again, that combination for these characters, it's funny because it's sad and it's sad because it's funny. And his death is really tragic because he doesn't deserve to die. He didn't really do anything wrong. No. Obviously he ends up, killing a dude, but not just sort of in defense. And he covers up
self-defense.
And he covers up a murder, but he's not a bad guy. He's just in a shitty situation. No. And so his death is the most tragic, probably.
It's really interesting too with those last scenes in the castle and into Palindrome, where Ed and Peggy are just running from everyone, shooting each other and stuff. And there's this huge moment with the UFO, and this 2 dialogue scene perfectly encapsulates Ed and Peggy. It's when the UFO is there, everyone's looking at it. It cuts to Ed and Peggy, and Ed's like, "Hun, are you seeing this?" And then Peggy's just like, "That's a UFO, Ed. Come on, let's go." And then they keep running, and it's like, that is so them. Like, totally. They just aren't on the same page. And again, there's so many scenes I want to talk about, but we should probably move on. But just like, there are so many good scenes with Ed and Peggy this season, and like just knowing their dynamic throughout makes season 2 endlessly rewatchable, because you're like, this is what they're always going for.
Right. And last thing on Ed before we move on, how great is that scene when he's at the butcher shop disposing of the body, and then Lou comes in, the finger under the door and everything, and he's like, the phone's ringing, he's like, "You gonna get that?" And Jesse Plemons just looks at him like, yeah. Like a half smile, like, oh shit.
And the finger's just right there. Jesse Plemons has a lot of good moments. I also love the scene where we'll talk about this character next, but he calls a character and he goes, I guess I'll spoil it. The next character we're going to talk about is worried. He goes, "Are you Mike Milligan?" makes me laugh every time. Are you Mike Milligan? He's so stupid. I got Dodd Gerharts in the back of my car. He's just so like, he sounds like so nasally in that scene for some reason. Like, unlike anything he sounded like before. Are you Mike Milligan? So let's talk about him. Let's talk about Mike Milligan and the Kitchen Brothers, the prog rock band, as well as Joe Bulo, Kansas City, the Kansas City Mafia. They are the people with the most action this season, I will say. They have a clear goal. And unlike everyone else in this season, they like get it. They like through some losses, but like they still accomplish their goals, which is to take over the Gerharts and start a new mafia, which we know from season 4 started way back in the 50s.
Thanks to Chris Rock, who invented credit cards.
And Glenn Turman,
That's
Dr.
right.
Senator.
That's right. I think, again, the fact that Kansas City wins, the organization wins at the end of the season, but the characters involved do not. Joe Bulo dies. His head is cut off. Mike Milligan ends up in an office, and he is so sad, and we'll come back to that in a second. But initially you think, oh, okay, so bad guys, again, just like we were talking about earlier. But then you get Mike Milligan, who has so much charisma and heart. And one of my criticisms that I've talked about in the past on our season 4 podcast was just like, at the time, you don't totally know why Mike Milligan wants power, why he wants to rise through the ranks, other than obviously people want to rise through the ranks. But like, I wanted a deeper reason, and season 4 definitely gave us that. So on the rewatch, it's even better. But his character is just so damn charming, and the performance is so damn charming. And after watching him in like 2 scenes in his first episode, I was like, who is that guy? He is lighting up the screen and completely stealing every scene that he's in. It was such a star-making performance, and I'm so sad that he hasn't had the kind of career that I had hoped for after Fargo. He's definitely in more and more things, and he was so good in this season. Every single scene was dynamic. There's this element of race that's at play in all of his scenes where he's talking to white characters. There's this element of like, he is the outsider, which is a character that we love in, and so is HANZEE, but Mike Milligan's more so the typical outsider. He also just Bokeem Woodbine as an actor got maybe one of the greatest gifts that any actor could get, like chewy, scene-stealing dialogue and monologues. Yeah. I guess, mostly monologues. But he could talk about anything. It's like a Tarantino movie. You could talk about anything. You could talk about pop culture. You could talk about tipping waitresses. You could talk about anything. It's just good. It's delicious. It comes off the tongue so well.
I watched a screenwriting video, and I told you this already, but I'll just say it so it's on the podcast. But like after everyone always complains that like after Tarantino, like everyone's dialogue was like, what about ketchup, huh? Like, isn't that a thing? Right. It just comes a shitty stand-up comedian. But anyways, like you're totally right. You're hitting the nail on the head with fucking Mike Milligan here. And I mean, for me, it's a star-making performance because he's someone I want to see all the time. And I remember when we talked about Fargo, we're like, who is this guy? Because he's super good. And we finally looked him up, and we thought he was like in his 20s or 30s or something. Yeah. And this was his first big thing. But like, Bokeem's like 50, nearing 60. Like, he looks so young, and he gives off such like a youthful presence in this show. And like, obviously, like it's partially like makeup and like the wig and stuff, but like it's incredible what he does this season. And like everyone else we've been talking about, there is a scene where there's just impending doom. He has no clue what to do, and then he gets out of it, and it's one of the best scenes ever. And it was going to be my scene that I picked, but I did not.
It's so good. Yeah, he comes out and just shoots the Undertaker. What a great moment. But Bokeem,
Who's the eggplant that can't stop shit in the bed?
Gentlemen. It's so good. But that's, yeah. And then the phone just rings. Again, there's like these random moments that just...
You, Mike Milligan.
These random moments that just line up perfectly for the characters that in another show with less intentionality and with less craft and careful planning would seem really sort of like a coincidence. But in this series and in this season, it feels purposefully random. And one other thought on Bokeem, just as a thing, I've always thought he had like major Dave Chappelle energy. Like, and I think that's why this character works for me so well also, is he could just stand on a stage and talk and smoke a cigarette. And I'd be like, damn, this was a great episode of Fargo.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with the plot.
I'm in a great, like, season 5 is just 10 hours of Bokeem Woodbine as Mike Milligan just smoking a cigarette.
Yeah. But yeah, he has that presence of like, of a performer. It feels very much like performance. And because of season 4, we know that it really is a performance.
Yeah. And yeah, especially with seeing Satchel's background after season 4, which we talked about extensively in This Is a True Podcast, episodes 1 through 10. But Bokeem and just Mike Milligan as a character are so interesting. There's so many things about race in this season that like hadn't been tackled up to this point. Like there was like one Native American guy in the original Fargo and like one Asian guy in the original Fargo too, who was very sad. And we'll talk about him on the next episode, which will be the next, which will be Fargo, the movie. Because we didn't really talk about this yet, but like we're going in chronological order of like continuity. So like season 4, 50s to 70s, movie was the 90s. Early 2000s was season 1, and then season 3 is the most recent, which is like in 2014, I want to say, and then it ends in 2017, but I digress. Anyways, there's a lot to be said about race, and especially with like Hank, that scene with him and Hank on the highway, and we'll talk about Hank soon. But again, Hank is like a lovable character, but he is also a white man in the 70s, which means he is probably racist in a little ways.
Yeah.
And there's that now famous line. Back then I remember being like, oh, that's so good. But in season 4 they repeat it, like Chris Rock says it, and like, you know, it's just really interesting. But it's that line where Mike Milligan goes like, no, you're like mean and you're rude, and like, but it's like the way you are, like you're doing me a favor. Like it's such a good line.
Yeah.
And like the way Mike Milligan is performative throughout the season, but when he gets serious, it's like also after season 4, it's like you can see the whole tragedy behind Satchel and like the man he's become, the man he's forced to become after the events of season 4. And it's a powerful performance, and it's so good. And then he goes right back where like Hank's like, how big are your shoes? And then like he's like, oh, I'm a size 10. The boys, and they flip him off. The Kitchen brothers, who are twins that are by his side for the much of the season, they both flip Hank the bird. No, he's like, I think that's 11, and because if it was 2, they'd be toddlers. And it's so good. And it's like,
yeah, that's one of the best.
It's such like a fun little line, but like that whole scene shows off how like Mike can be very fun but also very serious and be like, don't fuck with me, basically, because I'm a big mafia guy and I'll like fuck you up. And he does show that off. But let's talk about his arc this season.
Sure.
Because we didn't really touch on it, and I think it is one of the most important things. And we've talked about this in our previous episodes, but Mike, similar to Lou in a lot of ways, represents a disillusion with being a hero and the whole American identity of being a protagonist and being the hero of the story. Because Mike Milligan wants fame and glory, and he basically wants a castle and a crown and all this shit. And by the end of it, even though Kansas City won and they beat the Gerharts and he did everything he was supposed to do, he ends up in a desk job. And like the whole season, he wears a bolo tie. You know, it's like he wants to be a cowboy. He wants to be that slick hero from like a bygone era. And then by the end of it, it's just like, oh, you're pushing papers now, buddy. Welcome to the new America. And it's so sad and tragic. And that last scene of Mike just like sitting in the office that doesn't have a view of anything is just so sad. And him in his like nice red suit. It's just tragic. It's
a bummer because he wants to be Ronald Reagan. That's also the thing is like I think your point about like the disillusionment not just of America but of like the idea of the sort of Western hero, the protagonist, that's also representative in the Ronald Reagan portion of this, because Reagan, the whole season starts off with this fake Reagan movie where he is like this great cowboy. He never shows up in the scene, but like he's playing a cowboy at the massacre of Sioux Falls. And I guess we'll talk about the Native American aspect of this also when we talk about HANZEE, but like Ronald Reagan is a Western hero. Like he literally is a cowboy in movies. And then he just rises and rises through the ranks and then becomes president, and he gets to live in a castle, just like Bokeem, or just like Mike Milligan wants to as well.
But yeah, okay, so right before we get to our big character, I would say at the end, because it just kind of like happened like that. Let's talk about some of the fun side characters of the season. Fargo always has really fun, good, awesome side characters. And this season has the best side character ever in Carl Weathers.
Great.
Noreen is great too. Sunny is a lot of fun. Charlie is interesting. And again, we got like Ronald Reagan also. So yeah, whoever you want to talk about first, let's just start chatting about them.
I'd love to talk about Charlie for just a minute. Charlie's whole subplot is like one of my favorite subplots in the season, and it leads to just one of the most like electrifying sequences. Well, I guess I'll take it back even further. He just wants to be a part of this family. Like his dad just keeps saying like, no, just go off and do something respectable. Kind of like Don Corleone to Michael Corleone. But he's like, no, I'm going to be a part of this family. And so he and Dodd start going out, and Dodd shows him he's like, do you know how to shoot a gun? And then Charlie's like, yeah, check this out. Because he has the hand that is malformed or deformed. And so he has this physical impairment that, much like Floyd, Floyd being a woman sort of prevents her from doing the things that she wants to do, and it prevents her from ever getting the respect that she deserves. And then Charlie also, he has this physical disability that makes him a target for people to basically, people overlook what he can possibly provide to them. And so he goes into the butcher shop, and he has the intention of killing the butcher of Laverne. And he botches it, and then it leads to him going to prison, or to jail rather, and then that leads to Carl Weathers, who we'll talk about later. But his whole subplot is really, really lovely, and he's a character that you kind of root for because of the disability, and because it's such a tried and true formula of like this kid who doesn't fit in, who wants to be a part of the family. And then he just botches it. He goes to jail, and then we never see him again. It's really, it's another really sad casualty. He doesn't die, but like he's going to be in prison for a while, which is a really sad thing. But also maybe that's the best thing for Charlie, because he ends up surviving the season, and he never deserved to die because he was just a kid, So maybe if he hadn't been in jail, he would have ended up dead on that parking lot, just like everybody else in the family.
Right. Yeah, he is the only Gerhart who survives the season. I don't have anything more to add there. His lawyer, on the other hand, Carl Weathers, played by Nick Offerman, who is such like a perfect Fargo casting. Like if he wasn't already in Fargo, I would have casted him in my season 5 cast.
Right, go check that out.
Just because go check that out. But just because like he's like perfect for this world, and he really hits it out of the park. His best sequence is like definitely the police station sequence where like he's like super drunk and he's like, who called a lawyer here? But like he just comes in like guns ablazing physically, and he's like, I want to talk to my client and all this shit. And then like he has this whole big speech, and it's so funny. And then he goes out and like Bear Gerhardt has a bunch of people just outside. And then he comes back and he's like, call the department, get all the guns. And he's like he's taking a bench and he's like putting it in front of the door, but I'm pretty sure the door is like a pull door.
Right, it opens the other
so
way.
Like it doesn't do anything to it. But then he has, to balance that out, he has like this great scene where he tells Bear while he's nervously smoking a cigarette, he's all like, if you don't like leave now, like your boy is gonna, who knows what's gonna happen to him, but like if you leave right now, like he can get off in like 3 years, like 5 years max, and like stuff like that. And like I think that obviously speaks to like Carl Weathers as a character, like he can be serious, but like it also like shows what kind of guy Bear is. Like Bear, if he sees and hears something that makes sense to him, he's like, yeah, like I'm not gonna go all crazy, which also is just like the opposite of what you initially thought Bear was like, because he's the brute grunt force of the family that he literally gets shot in the side of the head at the end of the season, and he like doesn't die like immediately.
His name is literally
he's
Bear.
A tank. Yeah, he's a bear.
Yeah.
But he's also very sweet, and but also very, he's also very family oriented. He's a very interesting character. But I kind of talked about two characters there. But anything on Bear or Carl Weathers?
Well, yeah, with Carl Weathers, he gets a lot more time than I expected. Because when he was announced as a member of the cast, I was like, oh, okay, cool. It's going to be maybe like a Key and Peele level character where it just shows up late into the season, has like a few really interesting moments, but not a big character. But he actually gets like a lot of time. He gets some time with Betsy towards the end of the season, and lots of really funny like deep state conspiracy theory stuff early on. He has that bit with Ronald Reagan where he's like, I'm not going to shake his hand, and he's like, I loved you in that movie. So it was a real surprise, but a good surprise. I was really happy. I think you already got sort of to the heart of Bear's character. He is this brute looking dude, but kind of is family oriented. Yeah. That's all I really had on Bear. Real quick, I want to talk about Hank,
cool.
Because one, Ted Danson was not a figure in my life before Fargo, like he was for so many other people. You knew him from Cheers. You knew him from maybe you watched him on The Good Place. He's been in the procedural cop drama, whatever that show was, CSI. So he was already like an American sweetheart. He was a national treasure, but I really did not know him. I just knew that he was a person that existed. And so he comes into the show. He's got this lovely looking beard. First, I think he's never looked more handsome than he does in this season of Fargo. But he comes into the show and he has such a warmth and such a kindness. And also there's those scenes like we talked about with Mike Milligan where like there's like a little bit of a racistness to his character in a couple of scenes. There's just a lot of, he just feels like a real lived in character, praying that he wasn't going to die all season long. But the reason I just wanted to talk about him was because of the universal language thing. Because, and I've told you this many times, but his scene at the end of the season where he talks about the universal language and he does that thing. He's like, when my granddaughter draws a heart, it means love every time, no matter what. That's just what it means. That is kind of at the core of who I want to be as a writer. And like what I want out of TV that I watch as well. Because like it's so sincere, and I've been so obsessed with sincerity and earnestness in movies over the last year because of how sad the pandemic has been, So I'm just like obsessed with the earnestness in that scene where he's just like, this is stupid, obviously. Like I'm trying to make up a language, but like why not? Because like it's the intention is like purely good. It's to connect everybody and to make the world a better place. And that sounds like, obviously like some hacky sack hippie nonsense, but but it's really earnest and real also. So where we draw the line at what is like corny and cheesy versus what is sincere and earnest is a fine line to dance. And I think that in this scene, they never cross over into corny or cheesy. They stay in that sincerity and that earnestness. And it's just one of my favorite performance moments from television history because of how real it is and how just kind it is. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Hank beyond that.
But no, like Ted Danson gives such a good performance this season of Fargo, and you hit it on the head. It's earnest, it's nice. Like obviously, like the scene with when Betsy goes into Hank's office and there's like a fuck ton of like just weird scribblings. It's like it's obviously like a red herring for the alien stuff, but initially I was upset with what they gave us, but like the more I rewatch it, the more I'm like, no, this is like so sweet. And it's like, it's just like this earnestness that we need in the world today. And like, I think Hank really speaks to the person we need today. Like, while like, yes, he is a little racist.
Right.
Just like the genuine idea of like creating a universal language is like what we should strive towards. And all right, last but not least, let's talk about HANZEE O'Dent, who is so good this season. So from the start, HANZEE is just like a ticking time bomb in some ways. And it's not because he's an animal like everyone thinks he is, but it's just because of all the shit he has to go through. I always think about that scene where he goes to the bar and like, again, it's a little much, but I definitely think this happened. But like, they're like, you can't be here. And he's like, I just want a water. And it's like, oh, do you like this country, you asshole? And it's like, I just want water. And then the fucking guy just spits in his water.
Yeah.
He's like, did you spit in my water? And he goes, no. But it's just like this very tragic story of a man who's just, again, desperate for like a new life. He just wants to be out of the skin he's in. And it's sad, but it's also really interesting.
HANZEE is my favorite character from the season. He's always been my favorite character because I think that the representation of Native Americans in film and television is maybe more so than any other group the most disgusting. The way that they're portrayed is the most horrific. I've been watching a lot of Westerns recently because Criterion Channel has this last month, their curation for the month was Black Westerns. So it's Westerns with Black leading characters. And what I've come down to is like, I can't in good faith enjoy these movies anymore because they use the massacre of an entire group of people, or of groups of people, because, you know, it's many, many tribes, but they use the Holocaust of the Native American people as basically something to cheer at. It's a given that these are people that should be destroyed and completely obliterated and ethered because they're just pests. They're no better than rats. So that's where we come from. That's where we start. That's how movies depict Native Americans. But so that's where we're coming from. And while this is not, you know, a perfect depiction of a Native American by any stretch, because he is still like a bad guy and a villain, but a sympathetic one at that.
Yeah, and he is still referred to as, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But still, with all that being said, it's a character that's given so much depth and so much life and so much you have so much empathy for. And has never been has just been treated so horribly and is being treated horribly continually by the Gerharts. They don't view him as a human being whatsoever. And so that's what makes his betrayal of Dodd at the end of the season so satisfying, because Dodd never respected HANZEE. He never cared for HANZEE at all. And so HANZEE...
I think the last word like Dodd says to HANZEE is like, get me out of this place, you animal.
Yes, that's right.
Shit like that. Like, Yeah.
Yeah, and so the betrayal is powerful because of that. And the performance by Zahn McClarnon is so gosh darn good. As soon as the season finished, I was like, give this man everything he wants and deserves. I had read an interview during season 2 where he said, or somebody had asked him, like, what's the role that you would most like to play going forward? Because that's, a softball question that all hacky interviewers ask actors when they're first on the come up. But
yeah, we did not ask Edwin Lee Gibson that.
That's
question, though. So
go check that out.
Check that out.
But he was asked that question, and he said the character he'd most like to play is just a father, a guy. And I thought that was so powerful, because when you are Native American, when you are Black, when you are any minority group, you're asked to play a minority character so often, and race is important in daily life. So it's not to write a character that is raceless, but to write a character that's more than their race. And so that's what I hope for Zahn McClarnon going forward, is to have parts where he could just be somebody's dad. He's just so freaking good in this season. And HANZEE as a Native American character just adds a richness. The reason that we ask for more diversity in films and Hollywood and stuff is not just a skin deep issue. It's because there are a plethora of stories that have not yet been told because certain groups have been suppressed for so long. So Moonlight was never possible until Barry Jenkins came along and was given opportunities to make it. And you see that going forward. There's just so many stories that haven't been told yet, so many different types of stories. And so all of this is just to say that I love the inclusion of this Native American story and this Native American character. While it's not perfect by any stretch, it's not, peak representation. It's just something that it enriches the show and adds a layer that had not previously existed, not just in the show, but pretty much on television.
All right. And then our last little thing, I'm sure there's going to be a lot that's cut here. But let's talk about the mystical element of this season. It's something that's in every Fargo season, and we'll talk about it at this point in the pod for everyone, just at the very end real fast. This season has the most apparent one, but that also kind of ties in with the outer spaceness of the 70s and like all these random UFO sightings, until at the very end, like, it's all subtle, and then at the end a giant UFO just comes down and goes, "Hey, plot, stop." Like, all the plots are converging and the UFO's like, "Okay, I'm here, dude." But it's interesting, but I also think, like, I know a lot of people say like the UFO at the end is too much. It is a deus ex machina in some ways, but I think with how many UFO things they had throughout the season, you had to show it off.
It deepens the Americana, the sort of pop Americana of the whole thing, because the Coen brothers have always been interested in the American story in some way, shape, or form. And Fargo is in its own sort of way. It's always been talking about America. It's always been talking about American issues, and it's about American people, American culture, American society. And you can't talk about the 70s without talking about UFOs, because that's just a thing that was happening. There was such an uptick at that time, from the 70s all the way through to the early 90s. There's an uptick of I'm a big Ancient Aliens guy. Watch Ancient Aliens a lot. I don't necessarily believe in aliens, but I just love watching those kind of shows. But there's a huge uptick in the 70s, 80s, 90s because of the availability of cameras. Everybody's getting like VHS cameras that are kind of good quality, and like there's more consumer grade photography cameras as well. There's also more editing capabilities. So there's just like this uptick in the consciousness, in the American consciousness of UFOs and aliens. And you see it in the set design throughout the season also. It's not just the UFO in the sky, but like there are posters, and there are little bumper stickers and little things about UFOs and little green men. And so it just deepens the connection to America this season, just in the same way that like Ronald Reagan does, and how everybody's complaining about the long gas lines, which was an issue at the time. It grounds you in the time period so well. And then on top of that, it does serve as a little Deus Ex Machina at the end of the season, but it's probably the coolest Deus Ex Machina that I've ever seen in my life. You know, the Deus Ex Machina as a thing, as a convention. I'm curious when we decided, like, no more, because it was such a staple of classical theater. And I'm curious at what point in history, like maybe 100, 200, 300 years into the Deus Ex Machina, we were like, let's stop doing that. And in general, it's a convenience. But again, when you're talking about this bleak randomness that's all the way through the season, this just sort of adds to that. It's like, it's just like life is random. The human beings are random, and this alien species is random. And maybe it's also not an alien. Maybe it's not a real UFO. People call it out and acknowledge it, but also maybe it's not. I don't know.
Yeah. Also, everyone was just high. But it also
That's true.
That's an interesting point you bring up, though. It doesn't have anything to do with Fargo, but like it's like when we decided a Deus Ex Machina was kind of cliched and like didn't make sense, because for a long time it was like, oh, this is the best part of this fucking play. When like God comes down and stops everything and saves the day. Like, oh, I wish that could be like my life. It kind of makes you think like if Tarantino dialogue's ever gonna go out of style, and people are like, yeah, I don't know why, but they just kept talking about ketchup like in the 2000s, in the 90s. It's weird.
That actually, because the Deus Ex Machina thing, it was always God. It was an angel, or it was God, or something that was coming down from the heavens. And so I think that there's something to be said that the new God is not, the prototypical Jesus Christ figure. It's actually aliens.
An alien.
Yeah. So I think there's something to be gleaned from that. I'm not sure what exactly, but it certainly is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. And also one last mythical thing. Martin Freeman reappears in this season, and he reads from like the Book of Midwest Murders, which is introduced. The book reappears in season 4. I hope it reappears in all the seasons, because it's just cool. And also, speaking of Deus Ex Machina, it brings this aspect of like, these are historical retellings. Yes. And we have all of it in this book.
Well, yeah, because also like this is a true story. And so the connection to history and connection to like these factual tellings of stories in this book, again, strengthens the sort of the not necessarily realism, but like the fact that it is grounded in a reality, not only a framing device, not only a connection to quote unquote truth and fact, but also it's just another bold choice. You can't fault Fargo for playing it safe at any point. They never play it safe. They always make a bold choice. And so this was certainly one of them.
Exactly. And like we talked about earlier, like Fargo is all about these crazy stories, but also just coming back home at the end, which is the ending we see here. Betsy and Lou go to bed. All the ships in the harbor or whatever they say at the end. And it's a nice, sweet thing. And we're looking forward to talking about the rest of the series now that we got season 4 and season 2 out of the way. Next, we'll be talking about the movie. I've been Tyler.
I've been Daniel.
And this has been a true podcast. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff to Nothing Notable. We have a lot of great podcasts where we talk about some Oscar-nominated movies now. Nomadland and Judas and the Black Messiah reviews are up. We're definitely going to talk about Minari, hopefully before the Oscars. And Steven Yeun is the greatest actor of all time. And we said it because we both picked him for our Fargo Season 5 pitches.
That's right. We know what's up.
Subscribe to Steven Yeun. We've been the Nothing Notable podcast, but this is a true podcast, actually. This is a true podcast.